Welcome to Conversations from the Field, Incarcerated Survivors with Mental Illness. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded. Please use the chat box for questions. The opinions, findings, and conclusions in this webinar are those of the authors and guest speakers and not necessarily those of Cal-OES. This webinar is in collaboration between JDI and CALCASA under the Advancing Priya project. JDI is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention. It is JDI's fundamental belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety, no matter what crime someone has committed. Rape is not part of the penalty. We don't accept sexual abuse as an inevitable part of prison life. But we know that prisons and jails with committed leaders, good policies, and sound practices can keep inmates safe.
As the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, we are committed to ending sexual violence through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. We, as the California Advancing Priya project with JDI, we offer support and guidance to all of the rape crisis centers, California rape crisis centers, on how to build strong relationships with CDCR. And the most important part, we believe, is to create sustainability and agreements and protocols for provision of victim services to survivors as well.
Great, thank you, Juliana. And then just to talk a little bit about our project goals, which we hope this webinar will help to advance, especially because we're going to have two guests on our webinar today, and we're going to get to hear conversations from the perspective of folks working at CDCR and then the perspective of an advocate from a rape crisis center. And then, again, that's basically our agenda today, is to have these conversations and just to learn a little bit about the different perspectives and maybe just gain some insight onto what it's like to work with an incarcerated survivor with mental illness, and also just what their lives are like inside CDCR facilities. And so I will go ahead and introduce our first guest for this morning's conversation, Dr. Michael Hewitt from the California Institution for Women. And Dr. Hewitt, I don't know if you'd like to just kind of very briefly just tell us a little bit about your background and your role at CIW.
Sure. Thanks, Jess, for having me. I'm currently the Chief of Mental Health at the California Institution for Women. And I arrived in prison, not necessarily by design. I hadn't planned on coming to prison when I started my career. But I, about 14 years ago, had the opportunity to work for the state after working in community mental health, and started at the California Institution for Men, and was there for about 12 years working in their acute psychiatric unit, and then going on to work in various administrative tasks, running the program, running the restricted housing program, as well as I don't know if you can hear the alarm in the background, but that might happen.
That's life in a prison, yeah.
Then for the last 2 years, I've been the Chief of Mental Health at CIW. It's been quite a transition, and actually it was at CIW where I first started to really engage in the issues of sexual violence in prison. So I think that'll become telling as we go through this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so you sort of have this dual perspective of having worked at men's facilities for a long time and now working in a women's facility. And so I'm hoping that maybe today we can talk a little bit about how those might be different. But before we get to that, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how someone becomes involved in a mental health program in a facility, and sort of what separates the mental health program from something like general population.
Sure. Yeah, everybody that comes into an institution goes through a reception center process, and that's the first opportunity for us to screen for mental health issues. And we have a very brief and general question that we ask every person that comes into the institution. And once if there's a identified need for mental health services, then they go through a further assessment. And it's in reception where a lot of decisions are made about what services that the inmate is going to need. And so they'll be placed at the appropriate level of care, which could mean a potential transfer to an institution where that level of care occurs. And we have, at CIW, we have every level of care of mental health that you can get in the system. So we're a very relatively small institution, but with every level of mental health care that you can provide. And the range of services might be from seeing a clinician a minimum of every 90 days to seeing a clinician every week, to being provided with at least 10 hours of group structured treatment, and or an inpatient stay that would be equivalent to like a state hospital. And we have that service here. We call it the psychiatric inpatient program. So we have acute psychiatric services as well. So the range of services can really vary amongst the individuals, and so our goal is to have the person placed at the level of care that best facilitates their best functioning within the institution.
Right. And so it sounds like not every facility, and you said CIW has sort of all of the sort of services that could be available to somebody. So it sounds like not every CDCR facility has that range. And so folks around the state might be working with a facility that might not have, like you said, like inpatient
right.
psychiatric care. But would you say that every facility has some level of mental health services or programming, whether it's a lower level or a high level?
Well, actually, in our desert institutions, they have basically just sort of a transitional assessment, and they will transfer inmates to other facilities with our where we have more robust mental health services. And it's interesting because that really has to do with how hot it gets out there and the effects of the psychotropic medications and when patients are have exposed to hot conditions. So a lot of some of the services have been sort of centralized to other areas where we can best manage them.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And so you had mentioned earlier that since starting your role at CIW that you've been working, more in depth with issues around sexual abuse and trauma. And so in your experience, how do mental health program services or just, general services for inmates address some of these issues around sexual abuse and trauma?
It's actually, it's much more, it was very clear to me that there was a big distinction between how the men's institutions and the women's institutions deal with sexual trauma. The men's institutions in general really are at a level, for the most part, where they maintain their compliance with Priya standards. And so there's a lot of opportunities, and this certainly doesn't apply to every institution, but there's a lot of opportunities to broaden the conversation about sexual violence, because I think it's really, at least in my 12 years in the men's institution, we basically knew the basic protocols for Priya, but we did not have the engagement that we have here at CIW. And that's notable also because, there's, for women's facilities, we strive to provide gender-responsive services, and that's there's a lot more training and education amongst not only mental health but custody, education, nursing, medical, on issues of gender responsiveness and the different pathways that women, how women come to prison. And there's a lot of research out on this in terms of, really the way that women engage in incarceration and where they come from and what their needs are very different than men. So, so that's been a something that I think was striking to me, in that we rarely talked about sexual trauma in the men's institution. And in fact, I would say it's probably a lot more stigmatized there, and you know, there needs to be a further discussion about that. But here at CIW, I think we're much more actively engaged, and although we have a ways to go, we definitely feel like it's part of a conversation that we're having at pretty much all levels of administration, and much more happening at the line level for our staff as well.
Interesting. Yeah, and that's been my experience as well, sort of going into CIW a lot, and then going into some of the men's facilities as well. And I wonder if, Dr. Hewitt, it's been your experience that in the men's facilities, you know, once you're able to sort of get past that initial hesitation, that underneath that there's a lot of, you know, male inmates living in these facilities that have experienced like childhood sexual abuse. And I wonder if that is something that you've seen that is not sort of discussed at the surface.
Yeah, you know, in fact, because, you know, and I think one of the things we need to address as an institution is creating a climate of safety, a community of safety. And in the men's facilities, that's a much bigger challenge. You have a larger gang influence. There are specific restrictions and the level of physical violence and threat that not only our general population inmates experience, but also our mental health inmates in particular experience. Really having a discussion in an environment where there's constant threat becomes a big challenge. And so I think that when there have been opportunities, and I've, you know, when we've approached and done programming in the men's institutions, absolutely we've uncovered a huge responsiveness. So in other words, once you get past and you create a safe environment, and you can get the safety in with the men, then you tend to get a lot of responsiveness that can be, you know, really productive. And I think in some cases it's the first time that there's ever been a discussion about sexual violence for some of these men. So
yeah, definitely, yeah. Thank you. And so I kind of going along those lines, I'm wondering if you can share with us just some of the ways that you are working to bring in a trauma-informed approach to CIW.
Well, you know, it's been an evolution, and I think one of the hugest lessons I learned pretty early on was really within a women's institution the incredible value of community, and how important it is to create collaborative opportunities with the population, to really kind of build dialogue kind of amongst the stakeholders, and kind of, you know, open up that conversation. Because even here, I think at CIW, before I arrived, there had been, you know, I hear the history here where we kind of were sort of more in the forefront of dealing with sexual violence, and then even here that message and the environment kind of eroded. And so over the last 2 years, it's been a real challenge, and you know, I've been very happy to work with the warden on kind of creating sort of more of a community of safety where we can kind of bring in some of these kinds of opportunities. So some of the things we've done is expanded services, not just to our mental health population. So our mental health population is really built upon meeting certain diagnostic criteria. And if you look at the 10 diagnoses that we are sort of geared towards treatment, the one striking diagnosis that's not on there is post-traumatic stress disorder. The second diagnosis that's not on our sort of the criteria for inclusion into our programming would be substance use disorders. And to me, that's sort of a real statement about, because those two diagnoses are, you know, particularly related to sexual violence and trauma. And I think that we are not inclusive of that in our mental health service mission is a real area of concern for particularly the women that we serve, because that's really kind of central to the needs that we have in our population. So we've tried to create opportunities by opening up more of a clinic that's not necessarily doesn't require you to participate in our mental health delivery system, and so it's brief services in our, we call it the General Population Guidance and Resource Center, and it's kind of eventually, I think, going to be a drop-in center where we can kind of bring resources in. I think it's a great contact point for advocacy services, and so we're hoping to develop that further. That's been online this year, and it's been extremely popular. Some of our women don't want to participate in our mental health services because it keeps them from participating in some of the, like the CAMP program, which would get them reduced sentencing. And so really the stigma of getting mental health services, we kind of we're able to provide another access point to services. The other thing that we do is the three major female institutions, we meet on a quarterly basis and talk about providing gender-responsive, trauma-informed services and how we can build our programming. And that's attended by the warden, the CEO of mental health, and the chiefs of mental health. And we have ongoing projects where we're trying to kind of make sure that our programming meets the needs of our population. Of course, we have some programming within our mental health that addresses trauma. We have groups such as Seeking Safety. We build a lot upon the work of Stephanie Covington, and we're going to be doing some specific trauma-related substance abuse recovery from her model, so that's in the works in the future. We are, of course, have been partnering with JDI on a number of projects that I think has been really kind of kept us on track. Not only helping us kind of meet our Priya requirements through consultation, but I think looking at kind of, again, building more community support to, develop mentors within the institution. And again, just kind of looking for opportunities to really build community. We had a suicide prevention week, which really was different and exciting for this group, where we had 5 days of activities that were developed in collaboration with our inmate suicide prevention committee. And a lot of the issues we dealt with had to do were related to people needing to feel safe, and it was really a very successful. We actually raised money for suicide prevention, and so we do a lot of these things, I think, to create much more of a dialogue that this is a community that you're a part of, and that we're all working towards making it a safe and productive community for you to program. And today's inmates are tomorrow's neighbors, and so we really take that to heart, that we want to prepare people for being able to function out in the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I heard my colleague go, yeah, in agreement to that statement, right? I think a lot of times, we forget that the folks that are living in there are going to be living out here, most of them, and before we know it. And of course, we want folks to come out feeling, like they've experienced some healing, right? And I think, everything that's happening at CIW is very exciting. And I'm wondering, how you see that approach spreading to other CDCR facilities, like men's facilities. Or have you not seen that? Have you seen resistance to that?
Well, I think it's important to understand the CDCR culture, and I think there are definitely opportunities, and I think there have been successes that I've heard of. So I wouldn't want to overstate that it's an impossible environment, because I think there are many opportunities. But I do think that the messaging of sexual violence and trauma can be very difficult for for custody and for in a custody environment for people to kind of really grasp what that means and how to address it. And I think more so on the men's side, where it's not sort of embedded in their training and programming besides the Priya requirements, it's a bigger hill to climb.
Right.
So I really do think, though, that what's been successful here has been really identifying sort of the key champions, and I think certainly I've really felt like it's been important for the leadership in mental health and the warden to be on board with being able to provide to look and provide these services that are beyond kind of the minimum required. And that's where I think good advocacy can occur, is in getting those key stakeholders engaged. You have to have people that can be your champions in this environment. Otherwise, it becomes a very difficult. It could be very isolating.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes, no, it does, and I think that these are for the advocates that are listening. I think those are strategies that are put to use in communities that they work in, and so it can be really challenging though to translate those strategies into these detention settings that may be unfamiliar, or maybe they're the staff that they're working with maybe are putting up more resistance, or not quite getting it or not quite absorbing it. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around how the advocates that are listening can do some of that advocacy work that you mentioned with like helping to identify some of the stakeholders in their facilities, or how they can become more involved specifically in mental health programming perhaps that might be happening at some of their local institutions.
Well, as I said, kind of identifying kind of who your champion is and having that network, and I think for the message, messaging the what you're there to provide is really key to really figuring out the tie-in to their mission. So even a big part of our dialogue as we've engaged in providing advocacy services here was we really had to talk through really what mental health's role is, and really what the advocate's role is, and how that can be beneficial to the mental health mission, as well as provide the service to the inmates. So I think from a custody perspective, safety and security is really the key. And if you can make sure that the message that when you increase the safety, the community of safety, you make their job easier, that's pretty much the most straightforward messaging that you can get to get sort of buy-in. I think that we certainly can talk about our successes, and here the services that we've brought on, providing counseling and advocacy for our here at CIW that exists outside of our mental health services that Vanessa Sapien's been doing. We've heard that it's increased our treatment compliance. Our patients are more active in participating in their own treatment, and they're more engaged. And so that right there is a win for us in mental health, because it really does complement services. And as I said before, we're not set up as our mission to deal with this in a direct way. In fact, I would say, we were really leery of dealing with trauma and opening up trauma in the men's side, because we were concerned that in this unsafe environment, you don't want to open too many boxes, and this person's now vulnerable. Right. Yeah. And that was a legitimate concern for mental health, and we're the ones that are supposed to be addressing this. In an ideal sense. so I really do think that being able to say that partnership actually expands your ability to be successful in mental health treatment and be also meet that kind of or try to meet that really unmet need is a critical message for the mental health side. That's something I think that's been really important for me.
Wonderful, and what a great strategy, right? To be able to say, we've seen these changes in facilities that are working in partnership with rape crisis centers or advocacy organizations, and it can happen here too, right?
Right, absolutely. I have no qualms about talking to my the other chiefs that I see all the time about how to structure these services so that they can kind of really add to and enhance our access to a population sometimes that we don't get access to. So, we get kind of locked into our silos sometimes, and one of the benefits in my mind of having these kind of partnerships is it kind of makes sure that we're treating the person, not just the mental illness. We have to provide we're part of the rehabilitation mission of the institution. And it may be surprising to some, I don't know, others may not be surprised, but that's a challenge for us sometimes because we're under such tight bureaucratic restraints that we kind of focus on these real rigid sort of processes and lose the bigger picture sometimes. So I think that it's been helpful for us to broaden our abilities as a mental health and look beyond kind of that real singular kind of mission, right, and add benefit to the inmate patients that we serve.
Yeah. Great. Well, it's so clear to me and hopefully to the advocates that are listening that we've identified a champion in you, Dr. Hewitt, and I want to thank you so much for all of your work and for your time this morning. I know you're very busy. You've got a lot to handle, and so if any of the advocates listening do have any questions, go ahead and send them in, and I will take them. And Dr. Hewitt, I might be following up with you for some additional wisdom. But again, I want to thank you very much for your time and for everything that you do.
Well, thank you very much for our partnership, and I appreciate the time to kind of share this. And however I can be of help, yeah, please forward any kind of questions to me, and I'd be glad to respond.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hewitt. I would like to now introduce Angelina. Jessica, is there anything that you would like to wrap up before we continue?
No, just I'm sorry that Dr. Hewitt couldn't join us for a longer conversation, but as the chief of mental health, he's a very busy guy, and so I was glad I was able to get him for as long as I was.
No, definitely, and I think we all can appreciate that he gave us an insight of his role and his role. I know that's something that we're constantly talking about and understanding each other's roles, and it's an amazing opportunity for everyone to hear a little bit about his daily routine and how his work is definitely providing some support to survivors inside detention as well. Thank you for an amazing conversation as well. And now I would like to introduce Angelina Alvarez. She works for Valley Oasis in the Antelope Valley as a project coordinator and sexual assault crisis counselor. She began with the organization as a volunteer advocate and now primarily works with the prevention efforts. And she considers herself very lucky to be part of the original group who began a lot of the work, a lot of the Priya work within CDCR in Lancaster. So welcome, Angelina. Can you hear us?
I can. Thank you. Welcome, everyone.
So I would like to, give you some time if you would like to just tell us a little bit about your background and your role at Valley Oasis and just the work that you're doing inside the CDCR facility in Lancaster.
Well, as you mentioned, I had started off as a volunteer advocate and was very fortunate to come on full-time with Valley Oasis and was a part of the first talk with our prison over here in Lancaster about this Priya grant, and it was a really a great meeting that my boss had established, and we were really fortunate. And with me taking a step back, we now have Deborah West that's handling the grant full time.
Great, great. Would you mind sharing a little bit about the relationship that you have with your CDCR facility right now? We constantly hear how it can be a little bit challenging, especially when we're talking about survivors with mental illness. Can you share a little bit about that relationship?
Well, we're actually very fortunate. We have a really good relationship with our facility. We have open communication, any type of questions that we have. It's very transparent. So we're actually pretty fortunate that we do have a good relationship with the facility.
And you talk about how you have an amazing relationship with them and it's transparent. And how did that begin? What was the initial interaction? Were there specific things that Valley Oasis did in order to achieve that?
Yes, and it actually started during our meetings with CalCASA and JDI and our facility. We spent a day and we kind of just laid everything out, what the prison's concerns were, what our concerns were, and how we can find a middle ground. So once we got all of the uncertainties and everybody's roles laid out, it made it a lot easier to move forward. And what we had done is we made it almost like our mission to learn their culture. We were going into their home, so we had to learn their culture, their language, things like that, so that when we're talking with them, it's not like two unknown languages. They've got their own acronyms, they have their own forms, and once we showed that we were putting in a vested interest into what they do and how they run things, their guard tended to drop a little bit. We were following their policies and procedures, we knew what they were, so we really educated ourselves on what was taking place within our facility, and that seemed to open the doors for us a lot.
And you talk a little bit about understanding each other's roles and languages. How is that different when working or even just serving someone who has mental illness? How is that different from just providing services to someone who theoretically doesn't have any mental illness?
Well, there are a lot of similarities, but the differences is when we're servicing someone with mental illness, they have different policies and procedures and forms that they have to fill out for things that they want or don't want. So when we know that, when we're working with the inmates with mental illness, we're able to help guide that inmate on what forms they need to fill out in order to get certain services at the prison, which makes our advocacy job a little bit easier because then we're able to communicate that with the prison staff, openly. We're not going, oh, they kind of want, X service, but we don't know how to do that. So with us knowing what their policies are and different procedures that need to take place, we're much better able to serve the inmates and have that open dialogue with ISU to get things done for our inmates, especially with mental illness.
And I love that you mentioned ISU. Is that, and we're constantly talking about having or understanding who our right contact is, right? So who would be the person that we reach out in regards to certain situations if we have a report or we have an incident or whatever not. Is ISU the one that's able to provide you with that information, specifically with the procedures and the policy and procedures when it comes to survivors with mental illness?
Yes. So we were actually pretty fortunate in our initial meeting. We established who each direct point of contact would be between the facility and with Valley Oasis. And so whenever somebody at the facility gets a promotion or they change to a different team, we are always given a direct point of contact. So if we have something that comes up or we need some paperwork, we're able to call ISU directly, speak with our direct point of contact, and get the information that we need right away.
Good. And you're talking a lot about the amazing relationship you have, and you have the contacts for, the right people for the right situation. Can you share a little bit about the challenges that you've also encountered when providing services to survivors behind bars with mental illnesses. It could be, challenges with just the access of, follow-up services or any type of challenge in just providing the direct services as well.
Some of the challenges is whether or not the staff believes the inmate, because the inmate may have a diagnosis such as schizophrenia, and so a lot of the times when an inmate comes forward with such diagnosis, they're not believed. Some of our inmates are in individual cells, so when they talk about being sexually assaulted, they're not always able to communicate clearly on where the sexual assault occurred, so it's assumed that it happened in the cell, and the guards dismiss their claims. So sometimes that is a difficulty for us, is getting the guards' own biases out of the way for us to do our job.
And, we're talking a little bit about, talked a little bit about, the credibility of the survivor. Can we circle a little bit about how you think mental health and CDCR staff can begin practicing more of a trauma-informed approach, via training or education or communication? What are some of the things that you feel would be appropriate for that?
What we do, because we do participate in some of the trainings at our facility, and what we remind everybody is no matter what you're there for, whether you are just what we, say just a general incarcerated inmate, or you're an inmate with some type of mental illness or any substance addiction, you're still a person. So when you go and you approach that victim and they've got this claim, first and foremost, your job is to believe them. That is your first and foremost approach, is to believe them. And then after that, that's when we advise ISU. Once you talk to the inmate and you give them the feeling that it's a safe environment, you're there to assist them, it doesn't matter what their mental illness is, you have a belief in what they're telling you, then you can conduct your investigation. And 9 out of 10 times we've found that approach makes inmates more willing to talk and move forward with any charges that they want to press against the perpetrator.
Great. And you've mentioned that you have a relationship with ISU. Is there a specific training that Valley Oasis has been able to implement, or is this more of an open conversation with them? You've mentioned a lot how you're fortunate to have an amazing relationship with them. Is it more of a structured conversation? Is it more of a let's sit down and go through a PowerPoint? How does that typically look?
So what we do is we do participate in some of their trainings, new employee trainings. We remind them that, when it comes up to this topic in training, we can come out and do that for you, cover it, give you a curriculum, and so they're really open about that. They also come to our advocate training and train our advocates on what their processes are, and we hold informal meetings with them if there's really nothing specific that we need to sit down and hash out. Every 3 months, we send an email touching bases with you. Is there anything coming up that we need to be aware of? It's just really informal. If there have been some things that have happened and we need to sit down with ISU, we just send them a Google Calendar, a meeting dates, and are you available? These are the people that we believe would be beneficial to sit in on this meeting. Give us 1 hour. We give them an agenda ahead of time, which they love, and we go over the things that we need to go over and discuss with them, and they're really open to it. It seems that because we have follow-through, and they can count on us. If we say we're going to do something, we do it, and it goes both ways, and I think that has really helped our relationship with them.
Great. I want to shift a little bit on, creative ways. Like we, as advocates, some of our challenges are to find the appropriate, self-care or, give the appropriate tools to our survivors. Can you share some creative self-care tools that you might be able to offer to a survivor behind bars? I know that's a big question, and we're constantly wanting to hear a little bit more about it. Can you share a little bit about the things that you've utilized, some things that might have worked, and some things that maybe didn't really work?
Two of the things that have really worked that we've been fortunate to do is we always talk about journaling. They're not given a lot of tools to have, but some of them can have, pen and paper at some points in time. And so we promote journaling. And the other thing that we promote is participating in some type of exercise program. One of the things that I use is I talk about going and doing yoga. Take a moment, to stretch, to breathe, to get a little bit of some self-care. And those two seem to work really well with our mental health inmates.
One of the big things that we've talked about is the challenge with journaling, right? How it can, become a challenge in confidentiality as well. Have you had any experience in which journaling, especially with a survivor with mental illness, has become more of a something that they're worried about, where they're not able to really share their emotions or really, use it as a self-care tool?
At this point in time, we haven't. That is a concern, but at this point in time, we have not had that issue come up.
And do you feel like there are some differences in the tools that you can provide to survivors with mental illnesses and those that don't have any? Are you able to, provide a variety of self-care ideas that might differ between the two survivors? It really would depend. If it was an inmate that we had concerns about journaling or participating in group activities, one of the things that we can do is, meditation. But as far as specific from mental health survivors versus survivors who don't have mental health issues, right now that's what we're kind of seeing is we're limited on what we can and can't offer to them. Great. Thank you. And as advocates, we practice the empowerment model, right? So given your experience, how might this look when servicing a survivor with a mental illness? And, what are some of the tips that you can give your fellow advocates? One of the tips I can give you is for our advocates is mental health is its own world on the facility. But if you go in and you treat them as a person and be cautious of whatever their diagnosis is, but treat them as a person, you get along really well with them, and they tend to be much more cooperative. That would be my tip for advocates going in with that. A lot of times I hear that you're the first person that's treated me like I'm not crazy. Thank you so much. And it's just going in and treating them as if they're any other person that's been in this situation. Just because they're an inmate and just because they have a mental illness doesn't mean that they don't have a right to be treated as a human being. And I think if we go in with that approach, we get a lot further in advocating for them because they're more willing to trust us. Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And, one of the conversations that we constantly have as just the entire team is safety, right? Safety and credibility. So can you briefly share how your agency approaches the conversation of safety for you or for your Priya advocates and the credibility, when you're providing services to mental illness as well, or survivors of mental illness? So safety, we went over extensively what the safety protocol was at the prison for having non-employees on site. We don't have any type of uniform or anything like that, and especially as females going into a male prison, it poses some other potential dangers. We learned that, if we're going into a certain area, I have the right to ask for not just one escort, but two. When we go into mental health ward, I
I make sure that I have the allotted, depending on what area we're in, we have an allotted number of guards that walk with us. I have a guard with me by the door, and what's really nice is the guards give us an option of a general area on where we speak with the inmates. And if I feel that I'm not safe or I'm not feeling comfortable with that inmate at that point in time, I can ask for extra security measures, and those requests are met 9 out of 10 times. So there are times, where an inmate feels uncomfortable with a certain guard. I will ask to have a different guard come around. It's really just a give and take. But if you know what their protocol is for safety for you, and it's written and you guys follow it, that helps out. And as long as you trust your own instincts, trust in what you're comfortable or not comfortable with. We tend to forget that the guards are in there all the time, and they tend to be more comfortable with the inmates than what you or I are going in there not as often. And so you need to make sure that your personal safety comes first, and then things will work out. Go ahead.
I want to, thank you for saying that. I know it, going inside facilities, and especially when we're going to go in there as advocates and provide services to survivors with mental illnesses, there's a lot of questions, right? There's a lot of unknowns. So thank you for sharing that, you should be asking questions, right? You should be asking questions. You should be aware of your own capacity as well, and, trust your instincts. These are your best tools. We as advocates are constantly receiving the crisis intervention training or the trauma-informed training, and there's not a lot of talk about, understanding our own capacity and understanding how we feel when we go inside these facilities. So can you continue sharing a little bit more about how that is very important, and how being able to ask these questions and being able to trust yourself is a big part of going inside the facility and providing services?
Absolutely. What you have to remember is we all have our own boundaries, our own comfort levels. My comfort level may be different than yours. But what I do is I go in and, for instance, I've had a mental health inmate that just made me feel really uncomfortable. He didn't really say or do anything, but just his presence made me really uncomfortable. And just that feeling alone, I asked for him to remain shackled. I wanted him to remain shackled. And the guards had no problem with it. And didn't do anything, but afterwards I learned that he was generally a combative inmate. So I made sure I trust my instincts. I asked for him to remain shackled. I felt a little crazy at first asking for it because he wasn't necessarily saying or doing anything that would have made anybody believe that I felt threatened, but just my personal instincts made me uncomfortable, and I stuck with that, and I was glad I did, because later, I was told he's normally combative, and I didn't want to be in that situation. You have a right to ask, for additional guards standing at the door when you're talking with them. Our prison, and I'm not sure how other facilities look, but they have rooms in which you can go into, and then they are still secured in a cell, but it still provides some type of confidentiality with the guards at the doors. If I'm not comfortable being in there, I let the inmate know, I'm sorry, I'm not going into that room at this point in time. And you have to establish what your boundaries are with those inmates as well, because at the end of the day, they're still inmates. So we need to make sure that our personal safety is met first and foremost, because if your personal safety isn't met, how are you going to provide services to an inmate if you're constantly looking over your shoulder and wondering what's going to happen?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We tend to forget that, and we go in there trying to provide these services, and we want to help everyone, but sometimes we forget to help ourselves, and understanding that as well. And just to wrap it up a little bit in this amazing conversation that we're having, what would be one thing that you wish someone would have told you when you began doing the work with Priya and when working with survivors behind bars with mental illness?
I wish someone would have told me that I have a right to ask questions. You kind of go in there sometimes with the feeling that you're the odd man out. And so in the beginning, I hesitated on asking questions. And now that I've gotten more comfortable, I'm like, oh, Lena, you should have said sooner. We would have given you this. Right to ask questions. We have a right to ask questions for an understanding of what's going on, what's taking place, who's in charge of what yard, how each yard works. Ask questions. It may be a different world when you walk into the facility, but always be willing to ask questions to learn more.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angelina, for being here and for just giving us a little bit more of a perspective of, the advocate role inside of a facility, specifically with working with survivors with mental illnesses. And we continue to encourage everyone to ask questions, both for Dr. Hewitt and even for Angelina. She is one of our peer leaders, so she is able to provide additional support, ask her questions about how, they began the relationship, how she feels as a strong advocate now in going and servicing survivors inside detention as well. So please feel free to ask these questions, and we will definitely forward them to Angelina or the right person. Angelina, do you have any final thoughts? We just want to thank you and, having such an amazing conversation with us.
No, thank you so much, Juliana, for this opportunity, and anybody listening, please feel free to ask any questions at all, and if I can be of any service in your movement from here on out with your facility, I'd be more than willing to help.
Thank you so much, Angelina. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton to my co-presenter, Jessica, who is going to talk a little bit more about Priya and mental illness. We want to just talk a little bit about the tools that you can utilize as well when providing services to survivors behind bars with mental illness. Jessica?
Great, thank you. Yes, this wouldn't be a California Advancing Priya training without just a little bit about Priya and specifically what are some of the key sort of standards within Priya that address survivors with mental illness. And so we're just going to talk briefly about a few of them. The first one being training for mental health staff, and this was something that Angelina kind of touched on a little bit. So folks are probably aware that under Priya, all staff are required to receive training around Priya and sexual abuse and survivor rights and their responsibilities and whatnot. Under Priya, however, medical and mental health staff are required to receive specialized training that specifically addresses some of the issues that are here on the screen. So detecting and assessing signs of abuse, responding effectively, and those sorts of things. And those are things that you all are experts in. And so if there's an opportunity for you to lend a hand to some of the mental health staff in your facility, that could be a way in. That could be a way to help identify, as Dr. Hewitt said, who some of the champions are, and a way for you to maybe even supplement some of the training that they already are receiving, and to go even deeper and maybe even to bring in some of that trauma-informed perspective into the facilities. Juliana, go ahead and forward me to the next slide. Another, I think, really important opportunity to connect with survivors is during the screening process. And so as Dr. Hewitt mentioned, inmates are screened not only for any signs or history of mental illness, but also for history of sexual abuse, right? And if someone discloses that they have a history of sexual abuse, as you can see here, they're offered a follow-up meeting with medical or mental health practitioner within 14 days, right? And so that mental health practitioner is going to be someone from CDCR, but if you are able to build really strong relationships with either the intake officers and or mental health staff, that could be an additional way for you to say, hey, we can offer additional support to any folks that in the intake process disclose sexual victimization, whether or not, they have any mental illnesses as well. Next slide. And then again, similarly is the standard here about access to emergency medical and mental health services. And so as you can see right here, inmates of sexual abuse shall receive timely, unimpeded access to emergency medical treatment and crisis intervention services. And I think this next part is key. The nature and scope of which are determined by medical and mental health practitioners. So again, if you're able to build those relationships with mental health staff and find those champions, you can get yourself sort of on that list of possible, referrals for folks who might need crisis intervention services, for example. It's named right here. And so that's a really, really another great opportunity for you to, again, just kind of build yourselves up as experts in this and able to really help, take some off the plate of a lot of these overworked staff in these facilities. Next one. And this one, again, is just related to the earlier ones, just another opportunity for you to insert yourself as a key sort of player in a lot of these. You may be aware that facilities offer medical and mental health evaluations for folks who have experienced sexual abuse, follow-up services, treatment plans, all these kinds of things are named here. And again, finding those champions, getting yourself connected, building relationships with some of the folks that are in mental health services can help increase access to survivors to your services. And so that way, again, since we're about the empowerment model, we're about providing options, folks are going to receive treatment from folks in mental health services, but they also can have the option to receive additional support from you all, consistent with the community level of care, as you can see here in Part C. And you all are a big part of that community level of care, right? Next slide, Juliana. So just to wrap things up here, remember, again, so much of this work is about working cross-culturally, really, to understand that the roles are going to be different for the staff working in these facilities, and the language is going to be different. You may be talking about the same thing and using entirely different words, right? And so it's important to kind of be able to translate what it is that you're needing or what it is that you want to say into a language that they'll understand, and also to be able to translate what they're saying in a way that kind of makes sense for you. Of course, to recognize some of the challenges and to maintain healthy boundaries, as Angelina talked about. And specifically when it comes to incarcerated survivors with mental illness, really to understand your capacity, right? Unless you have a mental health background and are a mental health practitioner, it may very well be that you may not be able to provide some of the services that some of these survivors might be asking. And it's okay to say that, and it's okay to say that, this is what you can provide and this is what you can't provide, and you can even frame it in such a way that, this person deserves more than you're able to offer, right? And that way you're also using that empowerment model, and you're making it not a problem with that survivor, but a problem with you, if that makes sense. And again, collaborating with staff is always key. At any time that you're connecting with staff is an opportunity to really listen to what it is that they're saying they need, to really just sell yourself. Really, I mean, you're kind of like, we're not used to selling ourselves in that way, but that's really kind of what we're able to do when we're collaborating with staff, is just to sell ourselves and say, this is how I can be useful. And using Dr. Hewitt's example of talking about how, engaging with advocacy services at CIW has created sort of an increase in folks using and attending their mental health care, right? And that's something that can be used as a way to say, hey, it's working over there, let's try it here. And then, as Angelina mentioned, just ask questions. And I think sometimes we don't want to come off like we don't know stuff or that we're not informed. But it's okay to say, I'm not used to working in this environment. There's a lot that I don't know, can you help me understand it? Because they're probably thinking the same thing about your role as an advocate, and maybe they're also afraid to ask questions about your role and what it is that you can provide. And so just remember to ask those questions.
Definitely.
Speaking of which, I think we're at that time to ask questions.
Feel free to ask questions on the chat box, and we definitely want to provide some space to respond to one or two of them if there's any. And if they're directly, questions that Dr. Hewitt or Angelina can respond to, we will definitely forward these to them as well. We want to remind you, everyone, of the additional resources that we have available. Please, visit the Detention International website, the CASA website. We have webinars and information in regards to the project and a lot of the work that's being done. And we cannot emphasize enough to utilize the Priya Resource Center. They have tons and tons of trainings, and the FAQ section is an amazing tool as well. They now have a link to the audits that are being done in the CDCR facilities as well. Those can be utilized as tools for you to develop conversations and possible trainings with your facilities as well. If you have any questions, if you need any type of support, please feel free to just reach out to the Priya via the Priya contact information. It's at advocate@detention.org or at priya@casa.org as well. We always love to hear from you. We love to get the questions and, just say hi once in a while as well. Jessica, it doesn't seem like we have too many questions coming up, which is okay. Again, reach out to us with any questions.
That's all right. We're not going anywhere. You can reach us via email if something comes up later.
We'll be here.
Yes, we will be. And then if folks don't have any questions, we're going to end things on a good note here with all of our furry babies that are up here. From our family to yours, thanks so much thanks so much for attending and for all of your hard work. And we know that this is not easy. We know that this is it's a very foreign environment. It can be a scary environment. A lot of it is unknown. And so we appreciate, your dedication to this and your willingness to open up, your services to the folks who really need it. So thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, everyone. And just to piggyback on what Jessica said, we as well as the team are learning with you as we go in this journey. So all the questions and all the conversations that we are able to have with you are definitely tools that we are keeping as well. And, just like what we learned from Angelina and Dr. Hewitt today, we wouldn't be able to, learn these things if it wasn't for you as advocates. So thank you so much.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jessica, for being such an amazing co-host with you today.
Oh, likewise. We'll have to do this again.
Have to. Everyone have an amazing day.
All right. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.